folks. I'm James Gibbs, Director of the Roosevelt Wildlife Station. I'll be your host tonight, and I'm pleased to welcome you to SUNY ESF, located both here in Syracuse as well as on the original territory of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. We appreciate and are grateful to our Onondaga neighbors. I know you're all here to learn about lions, as am I, but before we get started, I would just like to take a moment to recognize a very significant event, the Centennial of the Roosevelt Wildlife Station. Nearly 100 years ago, the New York State Legislature established here at the brand new, then, New York State College of Forestry, now SUNY ESF, a wildlife memorial to Theodore Roosevelt, New York native, statesman, author, scientist, explorer, soldier, rancher, hunter, naturalist, and perhaps above all, conservationist. As far as we know, Theodore Roosevelt was delighted with the idea of this new institution. The first investigators and the students they trained together launched the whole field of wildlife management, wildlife conservation as we know it today. In recent years, many here at ESF and many here in the audience, many supporters have worked hard to build on this legacy and revitalize the Roosevelt Wildlife Station. Perhaps the most singular accomplishment of this revitalization effort has been the creation of an endowed program in wildlife conservation that is focused on the sustainable use of wildlife populations. And our main speaker tonight, Dr. Jerry Belant, is the product of that effort. To tell you a little bit more about this program and especially to recognize our conservation partners who have made it happen, as well as to introduce our speaker tonight, I now turn to Dr. David Newman, ESF's newly appointed interim provost. Thank you all for coming.
Wow. Sitting in the front row, I didn't realize how full it had gotten. Thank you, James. It is my pleasure to recognize a key partner tonight, the Campfire Conservation Fund, of which several board members are in the audience tonight. Could those members please stand so people can see you? The Campfire Conservation Fund originated from the Campfire Club of America, which was founded in 1897 by notable hunter conservationists, including Theodore Roosevelt, Dan Beard, William T. Hornaday, and Ernest Thompson Seton. The club has earned an unsurpassed yet understated reputation in wildlife conservation through their efforts to establish the Adirondack Park and Glacier National Park, restore bison to Western North America, and to end the millinery trade, among many other things. The Campfire Conservation Fund was established in 1977 to, in very broad strokes, articulate the role of hunters as conservationists and support science-based conservation of wildlife and their habitats. So, not surprisingly, they have long supported wildlife programs at ESF. Their partnership with the college has grown in recent years due to a shared commitment to ensure that the technical expertise required to manage for the sustainable use of wildlife resources is not lost from university programs. Toward that end, they established the first ever Campfire Conservation Fund Professor of Wildlife Conservation, the only endowed wildlife professorship of any kind in the northeastern United States. In addition to naming the professorship, we further recognize the value of their partnership by our dedication of this conferencing space in their name. And I hope you'll visit the plaque that's just outside the door here commemorating this dedication. I just noticed that today, and it's been up there for 6 months, so it's worthwhile to do. Now, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Jerry Belant. Jerry holds degrees from the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, and the University of Alaska, Fairbanks, and was previously the Dale H. Arner Distinguished Professor at Mississippi State University. He has published more than 250 scientific papers and books that focus on 3 major areas: the ecology and resolution of human-wildlife conflict management, international conservation, and harvest management. His talk tonight on lion conservation in Africa is likely to touch a bit on each of these themes. He's only been at ESF since August of this past year and already has more than 12 graduate students and technical staff working on projects from brown bears on the Kodiak Archipelago in Alaska to carnivore conservation on the island of Borneo. Very wide-ranging. So, without further ado, I'll turn things over to Jerry. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much for that, and I appreciate all of you coming this evening. And tonight what I'll be doing is speaking to the status of lions and their conservation work our group and others are doing relative to population monitoring, how that can be used to monitor not only threats to lions, but also conservation actions designed for the benefit of lions and their prey. And ending with some thoughts on how we might further ensure we're able to maintain lions well into the future. And I throw in a couple of personal anecdotes too of our time in Serengeti. So when we think about lions, they've captured the attention of humans for millennia, and it really doesn't take long to understand why. Their large size, some of the males that we've captured have weighed close to 500 pounds. And on males, a mane of them that's just fabulous and unique to the cat family are just some of the reasons. In addition, lions are the only species of cat that are social, and they have prides that can have 20, even 30 individuals. And this allows for the shared rearing of young as well as cooperative hunting. In addition, the lions may rest up to 18 hours a day. They're also pretty efficient predators, and wherever they occur tend to be the apex or top carnivore in the system. And because of this and many other reasons, people are captivated by lions, and many thousands, even millions of people will travel around the world just for a glimpse of this magnificent species. We call these lion jams. Yet amidst all this interest, both from the public and scientific community, lions are similar to most other large carnivores worldwide in that their populations are declining. In fact, more than 80% of large carnivore species worldwide are in decline. And to provide some perspective, when we look at the inset map in the upper left, I first draw your attention to the tan-colored areas, and this is the historic range of lions. And as you can see, with the exception of much of the Sahara Desert and some dense tropical forests of Central and Western Africa, lions occurred throughout that continent. As well, they extended from southeastern Europe all the way to central India. And since these historic times, lion range has diminished dramatically. Within Europe and Asia, only a small population currently exists in the Gir forest of India. And in Africa, they're not doing quite so bad, but as you can see from the maroon-colored areas, their populations, or their range has retracted markedly. By some estimates, as much as 90% of their former range has been lost. And because of this, lions have been categorized as vulnerable to extinction by the International Union of Conservation for Nature since 1996, so quite some time. But all these maroon areas you see here are not equal. If we look at this more expanded map, if you will, the areas in maroon on this map within known lion distribution are considered lion strongholds. And these are areas that contain at least 500 individuals and also have strong protection measures, enforcement measures in place to ensure their persistence. And what you can see from this map is that currently there's only 10 lion strongholds remaining, and these are relegated to a few countries in southern and eastern Africa. So how many lions actually are there? And I think that's an amazing question, if I do say so myself. And the bottom line is we really don't know. It depends on who you talk to. You may hear numbers ranging anywhere from 17, 20, 23,000 individuals up to as high as 35,000 individuals. And the problem is lions, like most other large carnivore species, are very difficult to estimate their abundance. It's just challenging. However, most recent reports suggest lion populations may have declined by as much as 43% in recent years. And although no one will question that lions are in fact declining overall since historic times, Some people will argue with the numbers, and it's just because we struggle to have good estimates of populations that we're only just now beginning to develop, which I'll get to in a short while. But nevertheless, no matter what the numbers are, lions are not faring as well as they have previously. And there's a number of reasons for this. And one factor is human population growth. If we think about global populations, they're anticipated to increase to as much as 9 billion people by the year 2050. And these population increases are occurring most rapidly in areas that are less economically developed than what we experience here in upstate New York, for example. The population of humans in sub-Saharan Africa is almost at 1.1 billion. And consequently, agriculture is increasing rapidly in these areas, not only row crop agriculture, but also livestock or pastoralism that you see here in this image from the Ngorongoro Conservation Area. And what this land use change does is three basic things. One is it makes the habitat or landscape less suitable or completely unsuitable for lions because of alteration. Simultaneously, not only for lions, but it alters the habitat suitability for wild prey of the lion. And third, what it does is with this increase or human encroachment, if you will, it increases the propensity for human-lion conflict. Another factor having a strong negative effect is depletion of prey populations. Food required to sustain this burgeoning human population can only increase, and has resulted in a marked increase in illegal harvest of wildlife, not only for commercial sale in the black market, but also just for subsistence or individual or family use. And consequently, prey depletion has caused difficulties for lions in many areas throughout the range. And it also has a secondary effect in that with a loss of natural or wild prey, lions in some areas may increasingly turn to livestock as a food source. And when involved in conflicts, in the end, lions rarely win. And the outcome can have large adverse effects on populations. And here we see some young Maasai men that have killed a lion in retaliation for livestock that were killed by this or other individuals of the pride. And although the exact numbers are not known, retaliatory killing in response to livestock loss, as well as other forms of illegal harvest, is one of the greatest threats to lions. And this beautiful animal was taken during my first trip to Serengeti, and what I want to use it for is to discuss a little bit about legal hunting. Typically, of mature male lions, as you see here, has stimulated incredible debate among both the general public and the scientific community. And truth be told, in the past, in some areas, overexploitation of lions through hunting has occurred, causing issues with populations. And this was a consequence of a number of factors, including lack of knowledge about lion populations and general ecology, mismanagement of current regulatory framework that were in existence, as well as outright corruption by various individuals or governments. However, that's changed dramatically in recent years, and most countries have either implemented or are in the process of implementing age-based harvest strategies for lions, as well as limiting the number of lions that can be harvested or hunted per unit area, typically now no more than one lion per 1,000 or 2,000 square kilometers. Also, there's much greater adherence to regulatory frameworks and compliance, such that issues in the past with hunting have basically been eliminated. In fact, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the International Union for Conservation of Nature have gone on record stating that well-managed and regulated hunting does not adversely influence lion populations and, in fact, can benefit their conservation. So lion geographic range has clearly been reduced, as have populations, and there's a number of reasons for this, far more than I mentioned in that brief introduction. Yet we really don't understand the magnitude of these declines. And fundamental to wildlife management is understanding the distribution and abundance of species, and this is particularly true for species that are vulnerable and for species with low population numbers overall. So developing effective means to estimate lion abundance is important, such that governments and others can monitor populations in response to threats, or alternatively in a positive light in response to conservation measures designed to improve populations. So several years ago, I was invited to participate in this overall effort by working toward the development of population estimation techniques that are low cost and can be done over large spatial extents, but also were transferable to governments such that they can use those for long-term monitoring. And when I first got that phone call, I said, geez, I need to think about that. Can I call you back? And actually, I'm just kidding. I said, yes, right away. And so we ultimately settled on working in the Serengeti system in Tanzania. And there are a number of reasons for this, including government support, great access and infrastructure, and a strong baseline to lie in research in this area of more than 50 years of work. And the core of this ecosystem is Serengeti National Park, and it's that polygon in the middle, right in here. And the park itself is 14,763 square kilometers. And put it into context, it's a little bit larger than the state of Connecticut. And it's surrounded by a number of other protected areas, including Ngorongoro Conservation Area, Loliondo Game Controlled Area, the Masai Mara in Kenya, and Ikarongo, Grumeti, Namaswa Game Reserves. And it's an incredible place to work. And Serengeti, as you all know, is world famous for its ungulate migration, which currently includes about 1.4 million animals, predominantly wildebeest, but also zebra and gazelle. And when people think of Serengeti, most of us think of the expansive plains. In fact, the word Serengeti is derived from the Ma or Maasai language and translates to endless plains. However, much of the overall ecosystem is actually a matrix of savanna and woodland that you see in this image in the background, and also includes some areas of incredibly dense forests. So what I want to do now is help set the stage for some of the work. I'd like to introduce you to our field house, Karibu Sana. You are most welcome. And this is where our research is largely based from. And though modest by many standards, overall it serves our needs quite well. And it's located in, I put in quotes, a community called Serenera that's within the middle of Serengeti National Park. And here we're largely self-contained. We collect rainwater from the roof and store it in tanks like this, about 20,000 liters now we have. And as well, we have a small solar array, and recently we actually splurged and picked up a small refrigerator, so we're kind of living the high life right now. But the Serengeti is an amazing place to be, and we have an incredible array of encounters that we have right at the house, such as this bull elephant that was foraging in our backyard. And animals, they've become habituated to people, so it's a neutral response, and so we see so many species that it's incredible. And we liken our experiences there, we call them porch safaris, because we see so much wildlife right from our yard. Lion, zebra, impala, and many other species. Yet with this abundance of wildlife also comes some challenges we have to deal with. And if this works, it'll be amazing. Thank you very much. And for example, sometimes we have elephants in our driveway, and it's kind of cool in one perspective, but in another perspective, it makes it hard to get out and do your field work. And so we kind of have to wait for these things to move on. But they also provide benefits such as shrub pruning, and as well as fertilization of our facilities. And so they're kind of our unpaid yard care experts. But we do struggle with them at times, particularly during dry season, when we are competing with them for our limited water supply. As I mentioned, we use that water for all our drinking, bathing, laundry, cooking. But in dry season, water is pretty scarce, and the elephants like it too, and it's a struggle. So we have this situation like that, but as another water conservation strategy that we use, we have an outhouse or a cho that we use. And so, but just to save water, so we're not like flushing or anything like that. But even that can cause its own set of problems. And here's a picture of our outhouse. And this is our friend the buffalo, and this guy caused us trouble for a little over a week, and he actually would lie in ambush in the bushes that were just off to the left and wait for us to try to use the facility. At one point, he even chased Patrick, a member of our team, around the house until we were able to get a Land Rover over there and pick him up. But finally it moved off, and so all was well. But in addition to the encounters that we have outside of the house, we also have some wildlife encounters within our home. And if you look at this home from a wildlife perspective, you could think of it as semi-permeable, say. So we have things like rock and tree hyraxes that live in our roof. These things can weigh up to 10 pounds. And so they're in our roof, and occasionally they've fallen through the water-damaged portions of our ceiling and entered the living area. We also have vervet monkeys as well as olive baboon, and these are constantly patrolling around our house in the area looking for food. And when they're struggling for food, they occasionally throw rocks through our windows to enter and get into the pantry. The baboons, it was a challenge for quite some time getting them to quit opening our doorknobs. We finally have that figured out. And so we've had this going on and a number of other things, small birds, rodents, some scorpions. Several times a year, the army ants come through, and that can be a bit of a struggle. But the wildlife encounter that probably caused us the greatest alteration in our state of minds was this 6.5-foot long spitting cobra that lived under our bathtub for about a month. And so that got us going. And so these are just some of the examples of wildlife that we encounter before we actually go out in the field and do our wildlife work. So when we're doing our work, we spend a lot of time in vehicles, and we use Land Rovers because they work really well, particularly for off-road work. And in East Africa, there are a lot of spare parts, which is great. So tourists in Serengeti National Park, as well as most protected areas, typically are required to stay inside their vehicle for obvious reasons. And researchers are required to do the same unless they're specifically authorized for certain research activities. And so we often think of ourselves as kind of having two jobs. The first job is kind of what you see here, where we're going out in the bush. We're deploying cameras, monitoring lions, doing our population survey work, et cetera. And that's the job we really love. And our second job is actually maintaining the vehicles so that we're able to do the first job. And the roads in Serengeti are quite unforgiving, and off-road isn't much better. And oftentimes it seems like we're spending a majority of our time just keeping our vehicles running. Actually, it's our biggest expense is keeping these things on the road. For parts for this, typically we have to have them flown in. It's remote enough for that. And so when we're actually able to do our first job, it was conducting field work actually within the Serengeti Plains, which is in the southeastern portion of the park. And we selected this area because of good baseline of lion data, and it was very convenient, just a couple of kilometers from the house. And most of this area is savanna, but it does have some woodland on the perimeter of it. And another unique feature that I didn't describe, though, are the copies. And these copies are actually really cool in that they're granite or gneiss rock that, through volcanic action, brought to near the surface of the earth. And over time, the softer sandstone and mudstone eroded away, exposing these rocks. And the copies in Serengeti are estimated to be more than 550 million years old. So they've been around a while. And they're used by a credible array of wildlife, including lions. And lions use them for things like resting sites, particularly during the rainy season. Lions use copies to avoid bedding down on the wet vegetation. Also, they make great vantage points, and lions use them to survey the surrounding landscape. Lions also use copies as well as acacia trees during midday, where they provide shade from the intense equatorial sun. Lions are not very heat tolerant. Also, winds tend to be stronger on top of copies, and lions use them sometimes to reduce irritation caused by flies like you see here. And if a copy is not available, they might climb a sausage tree to escape for the same reasons. Lions actually are pretty good tree climbers. And finally, when available, copies provide a great location for rearing or giving birth to cubs and also rearing them during their first several months of life, providing both shelter and security. So lions in the Serengeti, they're not out there on their own. They share it with an incredible diversity of wildlife, both predators and prey. And during my professional career, I feel spoiled in so many ways, and I've been able to travel around much of the world and see a vast array of wildlife and natural beauty. But the first time I visited Serengeti, I likened it to sensory overload. It was actually more than I could have even imagined. And I still have that same feeling every time that I go. And some of the other wildlife that you'll see there includes things like the spotted hyena, which, like the lion, can also be a very effective predator. And they occur at population densities that order of magnitude more than lions, so they're quite prevalent. There's also a couple hundred cheetahs that call the Serengeti Plains their home. Jackals are very common, particularly the black-backed jackal that you see here. If you move southeast into the shortgrass plains and also into Ngorongoro, you'll see much more of the golden jackal, and then there are side-striped jackals scattered throughout. And finally, in the more wooded areas and riparian corridors within what's considered the Serengeti Plains, you can find the occasional leopard. And these carnivores all need to eat, and some of the things that you'll find there for ungulate species are things like this topi, which I just think are a magnificent animal, as well as zebra, which occur in the Serengeti, and up to several 100,000 participate in that annual migration as well. And though uncommon, eland also occur within the Serengeti. And of course, the Thompson gazelle, which is, you all know, is an iconic species of the plains. And in the more wooded areas, you can find large bands of impala, such as you see here, and of course, the common wildebeest. And now that we have some feeling for the area that we're working in and some of the wildlife that lives therein, I'm going to move into some of our initial survey work. And it's, as I mentioned, it's difficult to estimate abundance of lions, and I was charged with trying to find some techniques that could be used over large spatial extents. And so what I'll briefly describe are some techniques that we explored: track surveys, mark recapture variants, as well as camera surveys and call-ins. And the first one is track surveys. And to do this, we basically drove a series of transects, typically with a person sitting on the bonnet of the vehicle. And we would drive these routes at about 6 miles per hour until we encountered tracks. And you can see on the right image, we have lion tracks here, and just above that, deeper tracks of spotted hyena. And once we found those tracks, we take a series of measurements, photo document them. And I was very excited about this technique because the field approach is at least seemingly quite simple. The analytical approach is pretty straightforward, and had the potential to cover a lot of ground really quick. So I was very excited about trying this ourselves. But after spending, myself and Imani spending 2,000 miles on the hood of that vehicle, what we found out is that at least in Serengeti, the estimates that we derived were inaccurate and also quite imprecise, and so we found it not very suitable, at least in this system. Another method that we have evaluated is a mark recapture approach. And when you think about lions, particularly adult females, at first blush, they all look pretty similar. Yet if you look at them a little more closely, they have a great feature in that they have unique whisker spots. And they have these at birth, carry them throughout their lives, not too dissimilar from, think about humans and fingerprints. But what you're able to do when you are close enough to a lion is that you can photo document that and identify lions at the individual level. So what we did is we drove a series of transects like you see in those blue lines, and when we encountered lions, we would take their picture. And that would be our first mark, if you will. And then by repeating these transects, we were able to get recapture events from this and estimate lion abundance that was both accurate and precise. Now, we weren't the first ones to do this. In fact, this type of spatially explicit capture recapture has been around for about 15 years. And a couple of years ago, they had published the first article using lions in the Masai Mara and found it to be quite good. We did a variant of that approach and also found that this technique can be quite good, but it's limited a little bit in scope to areas where you can actually get close enough to lions to get a good sample of photographs and identify them, but it does have potential. Another one is camera surveys, and I have a lot of hope for these in the very near future because remote cameras are being more and more used very widely in all forms of wildlife conservation and research. And there's a number of groups that are currently working on automated ways of identifying species as well as coming up with means of estimating abundance. Because as you can imagine, if you have a couple hundred cameras out in the landscape, you can get millions of pictures pretty quick, and it takes a long time to go through them. So we need these automated methods that are accurate. But I have a lot of faith in that very soon we'll have techniques to estimate lions very well using this. And you can get some great information in addition to the friendly paw waves that you see from this lion. You get a lot of incredible secondary information from all the other wildlife. So we can look at a lot of other species at the same time. And related to lions, not only lions, but their prey, and see how that influences their distribution. And finally, we've been using Collin surveys over the last few years to estimate lion abundance. And this technique, too, has been around for several decades, but we've put some variations on it. Essentially, what we do is we broadcast calls and try to elicit a lion response where they'll approach and we can detect them and count them. Pretty straightforward that way. But a reported problem with call-in surveys is that they result in habituation. That is, if you go out and play the calls, the lions will come, you go out again, and they won't bother. And so what we did during our first survey is tried that, and we found the same thing. The first time we did it, we had lions coming at so many sites. The second time we did it, our response rate was 80% less. And the bad news is it got worse thereafter. And I think what the lions were thinking is that, oh, it's those guys in the Land Rover again. I'm just not going to worry about it, you know? And so what we did is we're very well able to document habituation, but it didn't do us much good for estimating our populations. So we did another trial, and what we learned from that trial is that if we alter the call type, we can basically trick the lions into thinking it's something different, and they'll keep coming. And that was real important relative to our modeling efforts to come up with a good way for estimating lions. And so we conduct our call-in surveys at night, typically after 7 p.m. when lions start becoming most active. And we use a combination of calls, including a single female lion roar. We use dying prey, whether it's wildebeest, zebra, or warthog. And then we use group hyena, like cackle calls, for example. And the lion roar is representing, or meant to represent, like a territorial incursion, hoping that lions will come and try to defend their space. The dying prey is a potential meal for these lions, and the hyena calls are meant to maybe be a form of curiosity, like what's going on over here. And we don't know in advance what state or condition the lions are going to be in, so we throw an array of calls at them, hoping that something will attract them. So we figured out the habituation, we figured out good call types, and once we had this solid approach for how to do these call-ins, we expanded our little trials and we tried to estimate the number of lions throughout Serengeti National Park. And as I mentioned, this park is a little bit bigger than Connecticut, so it's a pretty good piece of real estate, actually. And we established 80 locations that you can see by the blue dots or circles, and we went to each of these sites 5 times. Every 2 weeks, we went back to that site. And when you're at a site and we're broadcasting these calls for 70 minutes, it can seem like a long time, especially if you're listening to a dying warthog. It's a real long time. And so if you don't see anything, it can be even longer. But when things do go well and lions approach, you suddenly kind of perk up a bit. And when they do, we start doing systematic counts of individuals. And whenever possible, we also record lion gender and age class, such as a subadult male in the foreground. And so what I'm going to do now is show you a clip to give you a sense of what we experience when we're doing call-ins. And so this is basically what we see. Lions approach quite close, and they'll often lie down there and just kind of wait and see what happens there. We also detect a lot of hyena, spotted hyena. Almost every time we're at a site, we pick up hyena. And that's dying prey. This is what we listen to at night. And we've detected up to 28 lions at a single time and as many as 37 spotted hyenas. So it's a lot of carnivore biomass out there in front of you. And so, yeah, so just to give you a feel for what we have there. And so after we collect, this information, we have an opportunity to explore it and start to try to make some sense out of all these observations. Oh, and I should mention too, that we finish these things up, usually get back to the house about 4 in the morning. So just enough time to get a little nap and get ready for the morning routine. But what we have here are the results of the first session of that Collin survey throughout the park. And on that map, what it's meant to do is just show you the approximate numbers and approximate locations of where we were seeing these lions. And what I'm going to do is just kind of scroll through the 5 sessions that we did just to show you the spatial variation and numbers of lions detected over time. So in the second session, we see there's fewer lions, but more in the north than there were during the first session. In session 3, we had more lions in both the south and the north. Fewer lions again, but in the south mainly, but also a little bit more in the western corridor. And finally, in session 5, we have lions in the south and some in the north. But why I wanted to point this out and demonstrate to you is that at first blush, there really isn't a pattern. And so going out and doing a single call-in session can't really be expected to work. Lions may not be there for one thing, or lions may be in a state that they're not enticed to come and be counted. And so consequently, that's why we need to go multiple times so that we understand what lions are actually present in that area. And what this multiple session call-in survey does is it allows us to count for this variation, and consequently, we were able to estimate lion abundance throughout the park. And though lion research has been done there for many years, this is the first population estimate there ever was for the park. And we estimated 2,900 individuals with pretty good precision, really. And also, we were able to estimate spatial variation in that density and factors that might influence it. For example, in the western corridor here, where we basically have no lions, there's a huge number of humans living just outside the park on the boundary there. And so that and associated activities has basically precluded lions from occurring in that area. But even more importantly than that is that we had actually developed a cost-effective technique that can be used effectively in large spatial areas to estimate lion abundance. And I suggest that with all the work that's been done to estimate abundance, that there's no single technique that's really going to work well. But if you take our work along with the work of others and put it together, very soon we're going to have a reasonable toolbox that practitioners or government agencies can use to monitor lions, either in response to threats, as I mentioned, or in response to positive conservation action. And so we have this toolbox now. So how can we use this toolbox in terms of conservation actions? What are some of the strategies being used to try to help lions and improve their conservation? And some of the examples of this include animal husbandry, and there's a number of basic things that can be done in terms of night penning of your livestock, allowing synchrony of birthing so that you can kind of keep an eye on the calves when they're first born and try to protect them, making sure you have adult herders, not child herders, with your flocks or herds of cattle. But also you have bomas, and what we see here are a number of bomas or corrals that are used. The two on top are kind of, I wouldn't say traditional, but kind of little older style. Basically wood posts or poles with some wire. And as simple as they be, they are effective relative to nothing, relative to having free ranging. But there's some more ingenious techniques that work even better, such as these living fences. This one, a cactus, that actually makes a quite strong deterrent. And in Namibia here, you see this corral that they use for night penning that has this low visibility cloth. And along with the barbed wire outriggers, works really well for keeping both lion and leopard out. And so it's all of these forms are much better than the traditional, or much more effective than the more traditional thorny acacia branches that are used to make the bomas. And so this is a wonderful approach to mitigating human-lion conflict. And another approach that's met with some success is capturing lions, attaching GPS collars to these lions that are considered as potential problems, and then monitoring their movements in real time, like you see on this map in the upper left. And when lions enter open areas, as they're referred to in Tanzania, particularly in areas where there's considered high risk for human-lion conflict, ranger patrols are alerted via text message or WhatsApp or a telephone call, and will go to that site, try to find the lion and avert the conflict before it actually occurs. And this is actually a rather expensive technique, but it can be quite effective. And I should mention too that human-lion conflicts are critical, and the livestock losses that are incurred are quite important. But what I have to emphasize is not just lion conflicts with livestock, and it's a little bit different than what we are used to experiencing in North America, in that lions actually eat people. And in Tanzania alone, there's 50 to 60 people attacked by lions every year, and more than 2/3 of them result in fatality of the people. So it's quite serious and a little bit different from what we're used to. Two, investing in the training of individuals in East Africa, often formerly Maasai warriors, to work with their communities to mitigate lion conflict is a fantastic approach, and this is examples of the Lion Guardian program. It started in Kenya, has now expanded to several countries, and collectively they're working on 20,000 square kilometers of area, both to mitigate conflict, to provide education, as well as to actually stop lion hunts. There's a number of cultures in Africa. The Maasai are probably the most famous, where one of the traditions becoming a man is to kill dangerous game, particularly lions. And by providing education, this group is actually able to reduce that loss. Anti-poaching patrols, they've been used extensively across Africa to reduce the amount of shooting and illegal snaring. And for example, on the top image, the Serengeti De-Snaring Program, which is a joint effort with among Serengeti National Park, the Tanzania Tour Operators Association, and the Frankfurt Zoological Society. And what's unique about this program is that for their anti-poaching or anti-snaring patrols is they're actually going to the local communities and hiring poachers, figuring these are the people with the greatest knowledge base of the local area, and they also know all the other poachers. And so this program here started in 2017 and has been quite effective. Already they've removed over 17,000 snares from the Serengeti and have released a couple hundred individuals of wildlife. Below, the Sheldrick Wildlife Trust does a similar operation in Kenya, several areas within Kenya. But they don't just do de-snaring, they also do other forms of poaching, such as illegal hunting. But it's not just these NGOs and governments that do anti-poaching. Also, hunters do a lot of anti-poaching. And the example I use is from Tanzania. And they can have a pretty positive effect. If you look at the map in the upper right, you see those brown areas, and those are game reserves. And in Tanzania, game reserves are protected areas, but they allow legal hunting. And these game reserves are divided into blocks. These blocks are auctioned off, and if hunting operators win the sale or lease of that block, they're required to provide anti-poaching patrols in those areas. And the images that I have here are from Michel Mathiakis, and he's born and raised in Tanzania. And he's very proud of the anti-poaching that he does and the effectiveness of his program. So in this case, hunters do a lot. And if all of these blocks in Tanzania are auctioned off in the game reserves alone, it represents over 10% of the land area of that country. And when you have as much as 40% of the world's lion population living there, it can be pretty important. The final approach I want to talk about that's used to benefit lions and or their prey is community-based natural resource management. And this is occurring in a number of countries like Zimbabwe. Tanzania's recently started that in a number of their wildlife management areas. But the one I want to focus on a little bit is in Namibia. Namibia started their community-based natural resource management in the mid-1990s. And they are a point of pride for the country and serve as an example for other nations to emulate. And these communal areas are known as conservancies, and along with the Torah Conservancy that you see here, there's currently 86. And collectively, you've seen these kind of orangish colored polygons, but they represent about 20% of the land area of Namibia. And in terms of humans, about 8% of Namibia's population is involved in those. And the Ministry of Environment and Tourism of Namibia has basically empowered these local communities, whereby if they want to establish a conservancy, they have to develop a constitution as well as an incredibly detailed management plan for their natural resource management, particularly wildlife. Because in Namibia, what the government has recognized that if they want to conserve wildlife, they feel that they have to provide a very positive incentive for people such that the wildlife can be managed and prosper. And so these conservancies overall, they use a dual system of economies, if you will. One is hunting and the other is other forms of tourism. And what they found is that these two activities are quite complementary and they influence different portions of the economic chain of the local communities. In fact, a recent paper was published in 2016 and demonstrated that the benefits derived from hunting and other forms of tourism in terms of revenue generated to these peoples is about equal, and that both forms are required for these conservancies to be successful. So here we have an excellent example of effective large-scale management, 20% of a country basically, including positive benefits to lions and their prey. And they did this simply by empowering the local communities and giving them some control and allowing them also to derive virtually all of the economic benefit from that. And consequently, wildlife in Namibia overall, except for the recent drought, is flourishing, and a lot of that is due to this conservancy-based program that they have. And so the final approach I'll briefly mention are fences. And this also has the potential for aiding lion conservation. And whereas lions in East Africa, like Tanzania, are kind of free to roam wherever they want, in some portions of Africa, particularly southern Africa, fences are used quite extensively, and it's basically designed by the government to separate dangerous animals like lions from people. So it's kind of understandable. And so fences do have the potential for aiding lion conservation. However, there's a lot of controversy regarding this in terms of a number of people considering that these fences also, while they may benefit lions, they also fragment habitat. They could result in genetic isolation. They're also quite expensive to maintain. And also, fences are counter to what many of us think of as conservation. Nevertheless, in South Africa, for example, lion populations are doing quite well, and they do use fences, so it does need to be one other tool to consider in an overall framework for lion conservation. And so we have a myriad of successful approaches that are being implemented to improve human-lion conservation and coexistence, reverse the trend of declining prey, and provide informed management strategies and associated costs for protected areas, but only a handful of which I mentioned. There's many others beyond what we just talked about. And I think all of these approaches mentioned have real value and need to continue, but I also wonder in some ways if we're not skirting the edges about this whole issue, and if there's not potential for us to have even greater impact than we're currently having today to benefit lion conservation. And when I think about global conservation of wildlife for all of our challenges, I think of North America as a pretty decent example of what effective conservation can be. And so if you look at the top map on the land, those areas that are increasingly brown, darker brown, have an increasing number of threatened species. So when we look at North America and we compare it to sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in areas where lions currently occur, we see there's far more threatened species in sub-Saharan Africa than what we have here in the North America. And when we look at the bottom figure, those areas that are increasingly darker purple have been demonstrated or quantified to have a reduced effectiveness of their conservation actions. So what that implies is that our conservation activities in North America are more effective overall than those conservation efforts that are being employed in sub-Saharan Africa. And so when I think about that, I say, okay, my perception kind of seems like there's something to it, there's some validity to it, but what are the differences? So when I think about things like lion conservation, I think about anti-poaching, I think about human-lion conflict. All these things are kind of human constructs. So what I did is I turned to the World Bank and started looking at some of their information. And if you look at the top panel there, when we think about human density, the population density in sub-Saharan Africa is on average 2.5 times greater than what we have here in North America. And what that makes me think, or what it suggests to me, is that on average, there's a far greater need for natural resources, including wildlife per unit area in sub-Saharan Africa than we have here. Then I look at that second panel, and that's gross domestic product per capita or per individual. And on average, people in North America have a GDP 40 times greater than the average that you see in sub-Saharan Africa. And I have education in the bottom panel, and the list can go on and on. We can think about proportion of the population with electricity, proportion with running water, and so on and so forth. But I think about this, and could variations like this influence conservation of lions and other wildlife? And when I think about conservation, I think about it, it's not a luxury, but rather like lions, we are entirely dependent on our natural resources and the environment. And so we're no different than the other species. However, I suggest as people, it could be more challenging for those individuals in the present to fully embrace conservation when they may have far more pressing and immediate needs that they need to deal with than what we're used to dealing with. And so to more fully address lion conservation, I suggest that we as a discipline, as well as societally, consider parallel processes that over the short and long term can have what I think a far greater benefit to lion conservation. So I think we need to continue to work on these conservation strategies. We need to continue to work on means of evaluating the effectiveness of these strategies. But I also think that simultaneously we need to be working increasingly so with local communities and local governments while simultaneously addressing things like human livelihoods and well-being. Because I think that as residents or foreigners, hunters or non-hunters, scientists or society at large, we all have a shared goal of conserving this iconic species long into the future. And so with that, I want to make a few acknowledgements. I want to acknowledge some of the many wonderful people and entities. What you see in these top images are the two field crews, main field crews, and these folks worked tirelessly. That's all they did was work, and they're just an amazing bunch of folks. I also want to acknowledge some of the agencies, the Tanzania Wildlife Research Institute, particularly Dr. Robert Fumagwa, who's my collaborator on this project and also a great friend. Also want to acknowledge the Tanzania Wildlife Management Authority, particularly Dr. James Wakibara, who's been a huge supporter of us, as well as Mr. William Wakalema, Chief Park Warden of Serengeti National Park. And finally, I want to acknowledge the support from Safari Club International Foundation, particularly Dr. Chris Comer and Joe Gergen, who have provided incredible support and also were the primary financial sponsors of our work. And with that, I thank you. And so thanks so much for your time. If there's any questions,
Thank you very much, Jerry. That was fascinating. I'm sure Dr. Belant would welcome any questions that you might have. And I encourage you, don't hesitate. There are microphones. If you don't mind getting up, and there's one right over there. And there's another one, but please.
Okay.
Are the whisker markings, are they the same on both sides?
No, that's what's interesting about them. They're actually different on each side. So ideally what we do is we need good photos on both sides, because it's kind of like if we use our two index fingers, they're actually different as well. And it's the same with the whisker pattern array on lions. So we want both sides of those. And it's not just, whiskers are the primary thing, but also we can use things like tears on the ear, to kind of help, or some kind of scarring. But the whiskers are the driving feature that allows us to differentiate them, yes.
Is that true of domestic cats?
It's a really good question and one that I do not have an answer for. Sorry about that, but we are finding the same thing like in leopards, so it wouldn't surprise me, but there's a lot more cats than lions, so I'm not sure how much fine-tuning we can do. And when I talk about these whisker patterns, we're using them like on several hundred individuals. I don't know if that would apply to like 20,000, for example, it might. Actually, it probably technically does. It's just more a matter of if we can measure in that kind of detail. But thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for the presentation.
Oh, you bet.
Along the same lines, I was wondering, today's technology, they know everybody in this room if they take a video. I wonder if facial recognition software is what you were getting at when you were saying looking at all these cats. The second thing is, have you thought about doing a census? And it could be something like a mule that you get saliva samples from or something like that, I would think.
Yeah, to your first question, there is some software that has been developed to help with that. We don't have the technology that like our U.S. military has, And so, but in the end, with the software recognition, it's still, there's still uncertainty with that because we can't get the exact same angle and everything. So what it'll do is assign like a probability that it's the same. And in the end, we still need humans to help verify, at least at this point in time. And in terms of a census, it's really challenging to do things like censuses because a census means literally it's like a total count. Right. And so if I asked everyone to please stand still, I could cruise around the room and actually do a census. Yeah. But when you have things like groups or prides of lions moving around, it's really difficult. You can come close to that, and there's some analyses you can do, but a true census is very difficult. But it would be awesome if we could do it.
Thanks.
Yeah, you betcha.
Hi. First of all, I wanted to say, I really appreciate the presentation. That gives me a little bit more respect and admiration for the lions and the other animals in the ecology of the Serengeti. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome, and thanks for your kind words.
Yeah, and thank you. I have two questions.
Sure.
It has to do with the big game hunts are of course very controversial, and I've looked at both sides of this. So I just wanted to ask what your opinion was.
What my opinion is that for hunting, that I'm a hunter myself, and so I'm a big fan of sustainable use. I look at all of us, and we're constantly using our natural resources, in everything we do, and I have a much stronger preference for us using renewable resources as opposed to non-renewable, such as petroleum products, which are functionally non-renewable to us. So as a scientist, if the activity does not cause deleterious effects for the population, I have no objection to it. If it can actually enhance populations, I'm a huge fan,
Right. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, there were two specific questions related to that, and thank you for that.
Sure.
So there's the argument that, or maybe some people have perceived this, that the hunt can basically makes the lions more wary, which can take away from from your surveying and also from other tourism-based activities?
Yeah, I haven't actually seen the data on that, but conceptually, your comment makes sense in terms of any species that's hunted by another species is ultimately going to associate that species as a risk. And that risk in turn could facilitate avoidance, in this case by lions or whatever species it might be. And so in areas where you have hunting, you may not have as an optimal of phototourism, for example, and vice versa. And so like in Namibia, for example, they're using a combination. A lot of hunters will go to areas that phototourists will have no interest in going to, for example. And so what they're trying to do is they balance both activities, recognizing there's some areas that are more suitable for one activity, other areas more suitable for another, and they blend those together into a program.
Okay, cool. And so this is, and for wolves, there's a researcher who's kind of controversial. I can't remember his name, but he found data that found that with the more that the wolves were hunted, they actually took more game, more livestock. And basically what his discovery, and I know wolves and lions are different.
Sure.
Or his theory, I guess, behind this was that when you disrupt the pack structure of the wolves, you're having, they're not able to take their normal prey, so they're gonna have more like breeding pairs. They're gonna have more like livestock kills, more taking of animals that they wouldn't normally take because they don't have that same structure.
Sure.
And lions also have a different like pride type of structure. But do you find that could be something to?
It's possible, and a couple of comments on that is maybe the first is the study that you're referring to. I'm not sure if you read the couple of articles by other groups of scientists that found great issue and found flaws in that first paper that you described in terms of the analytical design and everything. And so there's quite a bit of question regarding the actual validity of the original work. But with that, let's say it was possible and it's been presumed to be possible in lions, though the data is scant. What these countries have gone to is this age-based system where they're hunting males that are past the age that they are maintaining prides. And what the idea is that they're no longer disrupting the social organization of prides because they're harvesting males that are past that age.
Right.
Is the approach that they're using.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. I
Oh,
appreciate
you're
it.
very welcome. Thank you. I guess a couple more and then we're going to skedaddle. So,
Hi,
Hello.
thank you for your presentation. I was wondering if you had found any data on prior to collar tracking and post collar tracking lions, if there was any significant cost-benefit analysis on human-lion interactions.
it's really difficult, and there's not, there's some data on it, but it's not great data. And the other thing, when you think about this, it's one thing when we talk about cost-benefit analysis of like livestock depredations relative to the techniques, and it's another thing when you talk about human-lion conflict relative to lions attacking people. It's simply, how do you put a price? You can't put a price on that or a value on human life, or it's very challenging, I would imagine. But what it is kind of two things. If it was a cost-benefit analysis of livestock depredation, the cost, not of the BOMAs, but of many of the techniques would likely exceed the actual cost of the livestock loss from the depredation. But that's maybe not the only issue involved in something like that in terms of educating people, trying to facilitate coexistence. I think there's other elements of it that together might give that greater value, even though your point on raw economics, if you will, would often skew in the area of the actual technique costing more than the cost of the livestock. But I think it's more complex than that, actually.
Okay. Yeah, I would agree with that. So do you, and you probably have more insight on the actual technological cost and physical cost of going out and collaring lions that you're tracking, but do you find that these specific lions that you're collaring are often the ones that end up in these interactions, or do you see that there's a larger population that you're missing out on because of the cost of the collars?
Both. And what it is, for example, I was just on the phone today with Stan who works with me, and one of our lions that we had collared has been involved in repeated livestock attacks just outside of Ikarongo Game Reserve, you know? So it's a kind of multifaceted. We're using this approach and working with Serengeti Ecosystem Fund to help try to avert human-lion conflict, but there's multiple other benefits that we're deriving from that. One is actually understanding or trying to understand what are the lions that are actually going to cause depredations of livestock, you know, because what we're thinking through time is that through our work and the work of others, we can pool that information and more specifically work to target those individuals that may have a greater propensity for this, for example. And in addition, we're using this movement data for our population estimates to refine our approach and understand why we observe what we observe. So it's kind of multifaceted. And some of the other projects that you see that are employing this are the same thing. It's not just a single objective, but there's multiple objectives. So we're trying to maximize the value that we get from handling these lines and attaching these collars.
Very cool. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Maybe we'll do one.
I guess we'll do one more.
All right. Thank you again, and yes, your use of visuals was amazing. My question is expanding on the fragmentation of the data
Sure.
species and stuff like that. You said the fences were mainly used in the south and stuff like that, but how are the other areas delineated? Are they also protected by fences, or is it kind of open?
You mean in southern African countries like
Like-
South Africa, Botswana?
Like, yeah, like where you were, for instance?
Oh, where I work, it's fence free. Yeah, there's no fences right there.
So is it mainly just on the southern part of Africa?
Yes,
Mainly
like Namibia has quite a few, South Africa, Botswana. But yeah, kind of in the southern horn areas where most of the fencing is.
And does this separate any populations, or is it mainly just?
Well, in South Africa, it actually gets more complicated than that because they actually do tons of human translocations of lions from one location to another, you know? And so there's a lot of human-induced movement of the lions in that country. And so, yes, it would definitely influence lion movement.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
That gives
for
me a much
sure.
clearer picture.
You bet. Thanks so much for your time, everyone.
Just a quick reminder, we do have a reception, lots of goodies back there. I know Dr. Belant will be lingering, and please, any further questions. And just really want to thank Jerry for that fascinating talk. Thank all of our friends here who've come from many organizations, especially Campfire and Downstate, have come a long way, and to thank all of you for coming this evening. So.